All right, everybody. Hello and welcome to the virtual Mind Walks lecture series. I know we are expecting a lot of attendees today, so we'll probably get some more in the next few minutes, but thank you everyone for being here. My name is Monica and I am with the Central Coast State Parks Association, or CSPA, and we're thrilled to be able to host the virtual Mind Walks lecture series with our state park partners. And today we have an awesome guest speaker from the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. I will introduce her in just a moment. As you can see on the screen there, you can check out centralcoastparks.org/mindwalks to see what mind walks we have set up for the future, and also to view other past recordings of presentations. We just have an amazing collection of wonderful guest speakers on there. I also wanted to say thank you to Thomas E. and Mary Kathryn Eltzroth. They are the underwriters of the Mind Walks program, and so we're very thankful for their support. If you would like to support the Mind Walks program as well, or any other state park program, you can check out that second link on the screen, which is centralcoastparks.org/friend, and you'll become a friend of CSPA and help support all kinds of educational programs in our state parks. So I'm going to click stop share on this screen. And let me pull up my other item here. So today's virtual Mind Walk is titled Kelp Forest Ecology and Restoration in California. And we're very excited to have Kristen Elsmore here with us. And throughout today's presentation, if you have any questions, you can use the chat feature or the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And you can ask questions at any point during today's program, but we will just address them at the end of the presentation. So we have Kristen Elsmore here, and she's an environmental scientist with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife's Marine Region, working primarily on kelp restoration and management. Kristen earned her BS in marine biology at UC Santa Cruz and MS and PhD in ecology at UC Davis. Her research at UC Davis explored physical and ecological consequences of kelp loss, utilizing kelp restoration as a tool to inform the ecology and management of nearshore resources. Through this work, she developed partnerships with multiple kelp restoration projects across California. Thank you so much for being here, Kristen. I will let you go ahead and share your screen and take it away. Thanks everyone for joining us.
Thank you so much, Monica, and thank you everyone for joining us today. It's very exciting to be here. I really appreciate being able to share a little bit about California's kelp forest with everyone. Can you see my screen okay?
Yes, you're looking good.
Okay, great. Let me see if I can move those bars out of my way. Okay, great. Hello, and thank you so much for having me today. As Monica said, my name is Kristen Elsmore, and I'm an environmental scientist with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And I primarily am working on kelp forest restoration and management within California's coastal waters. Today, I'll be sharing with you a little bit about California's iconic kelp forest ecosystems and some recent kelp research and restoration efforts that are underway. So to get everyone on the same page, we'll start with an introduction to kelp. So canopy-forming kelp forests are found all over the world and are marine foundation species, creating underwater forests that provide structural habitat, shelter, and food for hundreds of other organisms. Unlike plants, kelps don't have a formal root system or nutrient uptake within the substrate, like plants like a tree or vegetables in your garden. Instead, they have what's called a holdfast, which you can see. I don't know if you can see my mouse here down here at the bottom in the picture on the left. It's kind of like a sticky pad that anchors them to the seafloor. And so consequently, they don't adhere or grow very well onto the sandy substrate and really need that hard, rocky reef to adhere to and grow. Some of the species that we have gas-filled bladders that help the leaf-like blades float and remain suspended in the water column, which brings them up closer to the surface where they can get sufficient sunlight for photosynthesis. In California, here we have two dominant canopy-forming species. Before I go a little bit further, I just want to clarify, there's a surface canopy where you have the canopy forming up at the air-sea interface at the surface. but there are also subsurface canopies, which happen a little bit lower and closer to the seafloor. So I'm talking about that surface canopy layer. And so we have two species that form these really, really large kelp forests that reach all the way up to the surface. We have Macrocystis shown here on the left. It's also called giant kelp. And then Nereocystis shown here on the right, and that's referred to sometimes as bull kelp. And these two species extend throughout the water column, creating habitats for hundreds of other organisms. You can see here on the left that Macrocystis has those little gas bladders supporting the leaf-like blades spread throughout the water column. So you can see they're kind of each have their own little, each leaf has its own little balloon. The leaves, I'm calling them leaves, but they're called blades. And Nereocystis, which you see on the right here, it only has one gas bladder or a bulb up at the top that supports these pigtail-like clusters of blades that sit right at the surface, but sometimes will drop down below the surface as well. But really, all of that material is really concentrated up at the surface. These kelp forest systems we have in California differ physically and ecologically along the California coastline, and consequently are supporting different community structures and are exposed to different stressors and threats. So here you can see a cartoon of a Northern California kelp forest system. The forests in Northern California are largely dominated by Nereocystis, or that bull kelp that you can see on that far left of the cartoon here. And they support a really rich understory canopy and many invertebrates and fishes, and some key players in this system you can see shown here on the panel, but some really important dynamics and species that play an important dynamic in this system are, of course, your bull kelp, and then red and purple urchins, as well as Pycnopodia, the sunflower sea star, which you can see kind of depicted in the middle of this diagram here. In Southern California, these forests are largely dominated by Macrocystis, or that giant kelp, which is shown and labeled as number 1 here, really forming that thick surface canopy. And they also support a really rich understory canopy of these kind of shorter understory stipitate kelps. And then the key players in this system are, of course, giant kelp and red and purple urchins. And then we also have sheephead and spiny lobster, which play a pretty critical role as well, which you can see in this sort of secondary consumers bin up at the top here. In Central California, this is probably of most of interest to everyone here today. These kelp forests uniquely can be dominated by Macrocystis, that giant kelp, or Nereocystis, the bull kelp, or a combination of the two, which is pretty unique. And the key players in this system are, of course, those two species of canopy-forming kelp, red and purple urchins, Pycnopodia, the sunflower star, which you see here, and then also that southern sea otter depicted and labeled as like number 42 in this panel. And so as you could see, there's different communities that are residing along the coastline here in California. And these underwater forests are forming these really, really important habitats, and provide a wide range of ecosystem services, again, that are creating this habitat structure, this three-dimensional structure throughout the water column for other organisms to use as shelter and food. And they directly support that secondary production through that structure, and the secondary production of fish and other algae and invertebrates that live throughout the forest and make kelp forests that iconic ecosystem that we know and love. And these forests also support aquaculture, ecotourism. So you can see down here, a lot of people come from all over the world to come to visit our kelp forests. And they also support local fisheries, and people also harvest kelp itself. So in a sense, kelp isn't a fish, but it kind of gets lumped into that fishery bin, if you will. And each of these services are really, really important to us as California residents and to people who come and visit California from all over the world. There are also really important physical and ecological and social feedbacks that can impact kelp forest ecosystems. One important piece there that I'll kind of dig into a little bit is that kelp forests can substantially reduce current speeds. alter light availability, as well as nutrient and sediment transport within the nearshore environment. And this in turn can impact several key processes that are really important to sustaining our coastal ecosystems and marine resources. So I'll dive into those a little bit. So as I said, kelp forests can really strongly influence internal flows or current speeds, which are really critical for processes such as fertilization of broadcast spawners. So some of you may be familiar with the iconic abalone. So for example, here we have this a cartoon abalone. These are marine snails that rely on water flow to ensure that their eggs and sperm meet in the water column. So they'll release their eggs and sperm separately, and then they rely on that water mixing to ensure that the eggs and sperm meet and then ultimately result in fertilization. Those fertilized eggs, and eventually they become developed larvae, get transported out of the forest and then can come back into the forest. And the important processes, that transition is really important for larval growth and development, as well as for facilitating genetic connectivity among adjacent forests. So abalone, baby abalone that get released out of a forest in one area along the coastline, they spend some time offshore and recruit and come back. They could end up in either the same forest or a different forest positioned along the coastline. And that really is an important process for thinking about connectivity between these forests and among the forests. And that level of connectivity and that process really came into play when thinking about designing things like the marine protected areas, which are span all the way across the coastline here. And so ultimately, these larvae undergo biological processes such as settlement and recruitment when they're coming back into the kelp forest, where they're going to grow up and hopefully contribute to that life cycle again. So becoming adults and then going through that full life cycle. This settlement process here is really important for a lot of kelp forest species. They really rely on that hydrodynamic cue, or the water flow gives them a sense of where they are and if it's a good habitat to settle. There's also chemical cues, like they can sort of taste the bottom, if you will, if they're looking for that rocky reef. And so these processes are really, really important in driving who ends up where in these forests. And all of those little babies, the larvae that are coming back and in either coming up and going out in the water column or coming back and recruiting back down to the sea floor in the kelp forest, they're also at risk of getting consumed by other kelp forest species. Here you see a very not to scale cartoon of a barnacle. These barnacles are filter feeders, so they have these sort of like arm-like appendages where they filter particles such as larvae and other delicious detritus and things out of the water column. And so they get consumed down there, as well as up here at the surface. You can see in this cartoon, we have some larval or juvenile rockfish, which like to snack on larvae as well, or zooplankton, if you will. And so these organisms that reside within and recruit into the kelp forest play really key roles in the whole ecosystem and are supporting culturally and economically really important fisheries that we have here in California. Kind of switching gears a little bit, kelp really relies on the transport and mixing of cool, nutrient-rich water in order to grow. Kelp forests found all over the world tend to be really prolific in these upwelling regions. And so here in California, we have a really, really great upwelling conditions here. And these cool nutrient-rich waters that get brought up onto the shelf are really critical for kelp forests' rapid growth rates and continued persistence. So in recent years, you may have heard, but we've seen a devastation of our Northern California kelp forests, and that's largely been attributed to the warm and persistent waters brought by the warm blob and El Nino event in 2014 to 2015, and then 2015 to 2016. These events compounded along with the loss of a key predator, the sunflower star, which I had mentioned earlier, and coincided with a surge in urchin populations, which urchins have a tendency when they're in really high numbers to overgraze kind of like cows just like mow down a forest, or cows don't mow down forests, but they'll eat grass in the same sort of grazing way. And so while these warm waters impacted kelp forests in other areas within the state, California's north coast was really hit the hardest by these compounding events. So another set of processes have to do with sediment. And so benthic scouring, kind of like abrasion or rubbing of sediment on the rocks, is a really important process for kelp forest systems, as well as potential consequences of reef burial and impacts to water clarity. These are all things that can be impacted by sediment transport, which relies on water flow as a mechanism to move sediment up and down the coast or offshore, onshore. And so kelp forests, particularly young kelp recruits, so little baby kelps, are particularly vulnerable to scouring and burial that can occur along the edges of these rocky reefs, and in particular in places where coastal erosion covers, it can cover an entire reef in sediment. And so if and when that happens, this like scouring and reef burial can really drive patterns of kelp survival and persistence, and at times result in patchy forests, which you can see in this little cartoon, where this erosion, this burial process kind of killed off some baby kelps that maybe would have made it up to the surface if that sediment hadn't buried them. And so you can sometimes see this manifest in forests that we have along the coastline when you have these really extreme erosion events, and that can really suffocate organisms down below that also live on those reefs, not just the kelp itself. And another piece here, water clarity is super important for kelp growth and other forest inhabitants. So in particular, kelp, among other primary producers found within the forest, require light for photosynthesis and subsequent growth. And so having really clear waters is really, really important for rapid growth. And so these are just some of the processes and stressors that can impact kelp forest systems. There are many others, but these are just some that I dove into today. This deforestation and loss of kelp forests that we've seen some pretty severe cases of here in California, but this process and loss of kelp forests is a global challenge. This is not unique to California in terms of a challenge that we're facing. And kelp loss, this severe loss of your forest, can be caused by one or more stressors that operate either independently, so just one of them operating on your forest, or synergistically, like what we've seen in Northern California on the system. And you can end up in these different scenarios that are sort of alternative states to a kelp forest. But here in California, a lot of these stressors and shifts have predominantly resulted in urchin barrens. So you can see in the photos on the left, those are some schematic or some images of urchin barrens. And here in California, these barrens are largely dominated by the purple urchin, but there are other species of urchins that form barrens all around the world. The purple urchins here are native to California, and they're a natural part of the kelp forest ecosystem, as we touched on earlier. They're commonly found in kelp forest systems when you have these really thick luscious forests. However, California has been experiencing widespread and persistent barrens in several areas along the coastline. So as you can see here on the map, rocky reefs can flip back and forth between urchin barrens and kelp forest states, if you will. So these different colors, purples and pinks all around the world, are depicting whether a system was a kelp forest and then became a barren, if it flipped back, or if it stayed, or it flipped back and forth several times. And so you can see that this phenomenon of urchin barrens and these transitions are observed worldwide. And these shifts can occur naturally. However, conditions have to be just right, particularly for that shift from a barren state to a forested state. All right, so as we've discussed, these kelp forest ecosystems are ecologically and economically really important in California. And however, throughout the state, as we've talked about, kelp forests are increasingly threatened by multiple stressors, these including ocean warming, poor upwelling conditions, a sea star die-off, which you'll hear more about in the next Mind Walks talk. I think that's in a couple weeks. And then an increase in purple urchins, as we had mentioned, and then point and non-point source pollution, which I didn't really dig into today, but definitely impacts these kelp forests. And so impacts from all of these stressors have resulted in kelp forest declines throughout the state. And you can see here in this time series of kelp canopy from satellite imagery, you can really see that severe and persistent decline, particularly you can see really drastic in that North Coast region. And you see that sort of dashed red line indicates that that marine heat wave that started that marine heat wave in the Northeast Pacific, starting in 2014, that persisted through 2016. And this really resulted in significant impacts to the ecosystems and fisheries that we have here in California. And so all of these dynamics are discussed in a lot more detail within the giant kelp and bull kelp enhanced status report, which can be found on the department's marine species portal. This was released very recently in December of 2021. So if you haven't seen it yet, definitely go check it out. It's a really great resource on all things kelp and kelp management in California. So given this severe and persistent loss of bull kelp in California's North Coast, the state has taken action to adopt precautionary measures to protect against further reductions of bull kelp in Northern California. These actions include temporary closures of bull kelp harvest in Sonoma and Mendocino counties, where that decline was the most severe, it was hit the hardest, and then a limited harvest of bull kelp in Humboldt and Del Norte counties. And these regulations are intended to sunset upon the adoption of the statewide kelp restoration and management plan. So the department, as I had just mentioned, is working on developing a statewide adaptive ecosystem-based kelp restoration management plan. And in working towards this, the department's engaged in several exciting kelp research and restoration efforts. So to just touch on one really important document here, an interim action plan for protecting and restoring California's kelp forests was led by the Ocean Protection Council and developed in partnership with the department. And this was released a little over a year ago. And this action plan highlights several key research and pilot restoration efforts underway. If you want to learn a little bit more of some of the things I'll mention and I've talked about today, you can dig into this document. And it also identifies really important knowledge gaps and priorities for action that we should be taking over the next few years. So again, really great resource for things that we should be focusing on and tackling in the near future. In 2020, the department also worked with the California Sea Grant and the Ocean Protection Council to develop a funding call for proposals that address priority information gaps for the development of a kelp restoration toolkit. And these 6 funded projects are well underway. They're all very exciting and making great progress. And these 6 projects, you can learn more about them. It's called the Kelp Recovery Research Program. You can learn more about them on the California Sea Grant website. But just to list them off here, we have one that's focused on conservation genomics and gametophyte banking of bull kelp in California. Another one that's looking at where, when, and how. So it's providing a guide to kelp restoration in California using spatiotemporal models for kelp dynamics. Another one that's looking at a multi-pronged approach to kelp recovery along California's North Coast. That project in particular is a lot of moving parts and a lot of pieces. So tackling a lot of those questions that are identified in that kelp action plan, chipping away at those. Another one's looking at an assessment of practical methods for reestablishment of Northern California bull kelp populations at an ecologically relevant scale. Another one's looking at informing restoration and recovery of Central Coast kelp forests. So that might be another one of particular interest to viewers today, really looking at the dynamics of urchin recruitment, reproduction, and density. And then this last one here is scaling a new cost-effective intervention tool to restore and future-proof coastal kelp forests. These are all collectively really exciting projects and going to be moving us forward to better understanding how to protect and manage our kelp forests here in California. So the department, along with its partners, guided the development of a project to evaluate the efficacy of controlling urchins with commercial divers to promote natural bull kelp recruitment and explore the efficacy of bull kelp outplanting techniques, which hasn't been done before, which is super exciting. And this effort is in partnership with commercial divers and processors up in Fort Bragg, as well as us, CDFW, Reefs, the Ocean Protection Council, the Nature Conservancy, Watermen's Alliance, and the Noyo Center for Marine Science. So this work was funded by the Ocean Protection Council, and it began in early 2020 and is still underway. It's been a very exciting project to be a part of. And then another piece here we have going on is that recreational divers have spearheaded numerous grassroots efforts to try and promote kelp recovery by controlling urchin density. And so to facilitate these efforts, the Fish and Game Commission has taken several regulatory actions. So in 2018 and 2019, there was a purple urchin bag limit increase to 40 gallons per person in just Sonoma, Mendocino, and Humboldt counties. And then more recently, in 2020, there was an adoption of an unlimited take of purple urchin, just purple urchin, in Casper Cove, which is in Mendocino County, as well as an unlimited take of purple and red urchin at Tinker Reef. That site is in Monterey County, and some of you may have been involved in that project or are aware of that effort. This unlimited take of purple urchin in those two sites will sunset in April of 2024. So over the course of this effort and that window of time, these recreational efforts at these two sites are being monitored by a combination of partners, including Reef Tech, us, the department, as well as the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary staff. And monitoring of these efforts really is aiming to evaluate the effectiveness of in situ culling, or like in water culling of urchins by recreational divers, as well as understanding potential unintended consequences at these two sites. Again, just to clarify, at Casper Cove in Mendocino County, which is unlimited take of purple urchins only. And then at Tinker Reef in Monterey, we have unlimited take of purple and red urchins at that site. So alongside these pilot restoration projects that I talked about and the research that the state has been supporting, the department has also worked with partners to develop kelp management and policy documents, which I've already mentioned, but just to recap, these are the Ocean Protection Council Interim Kelp Action Plan that was published in February 2021. We have our enhanced status report for bull kelp and giant kelp, which was published December of 2021. And then just last month, there was that adoption of the bull kelp regulation changes. So again, adopted in February of this year. And so ultimately, these documents, along with the results from the pilot work and research that has been going on and will continue to go on in the near future, we're going to inform the development of a statewide adaptive ecosystem-based kelp restoration management plan. So you can see that listed here as next step on our big management and policy development. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for listening to me today, and I'd be happy to take any questions. I do want to point out here, I have our team email is down at the bottom if you have any questions that I wasn't able to address today, or if you think of some later as you're thinking about kelp forest as you carry on with your day. All right,
Awesome.
I'll turn it back to, thanks, Monica.
Thank you. That was great. We do have a couple questions that came through. So let me start with this one. What is the second common name for Nereocystis? I think I pronounced that wrong, but.
Sorry, I muted myself. The second common name?
Yes.
So we have, it's called bull kelp, and I think it's also called like Mermaid Whip or something, I think is the
I've heard
one.
something like that, mermaid something or other. Yeah.
But also these species have, I think they have a lot of different names. So I'm sure there are more than just those two.
Yeah. Thank you. Another question, how long does a kelp stalk live?
That's a really good question, and it depends on the species. So generally, Nereocystis, or the bull kelp, which is predominantly found up in like Northern California region, and then a little bit in Southern California, or sorry, Central California as well. Those are what we call annual species. So they complete their entire life cycle in 1 year. So they generally tend to live for just 1 year, and then they'll reproduce, and then the babies will grow up the next year and then become adults, and etc. There are some areas in California, some pockets where those annual species, those annual stands of bull kelp do persist through, they call them overwintering, so they'll live a little bit longer, but generally they live for just 1 year. Whereas giant kelp, depending on the kind of stress level and conditions that it's living in, tend to live anywhere. They certainly could live for just 1 year, but tend to live anywhere from like 2 to 7 years. That higher end of the range tends to be down in farther in Southern California, where you have a lot of protection from really intense wave energy. So these species tend to get ripped out in the really big storm events. And so if it's been a pretty mellow series of years oceanographically with pretty low level of wave energy, then perhaps they can live a little bit longer, especially if there's a lot of cool nutrient-rich water, keeping them happy and healthy, then they can live a little bit longer. But it's a bit of a range for that species, for the giant kelp. Does that answer your question?
I think so, but if it didn't, they can type another one. Their questions are flooding in, so.
Oh dear.
Has the reduction in bull kelp populations in Northern California sector been seen in the Central Coast as well?
Which specifically, just to clarify that question, you want to know the population situation for bull kelp in Central California?
Yes, it looks like.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And so the data that I was showing you earlier, that really stark decline came from satellite imagery, which is photos taken from space and processed to detect canopy cover. And one thing that's a really big challenge at that scale and that level is that it's really hard to distinguish between giant kelp and bull kelp from those imagery. It's really just kind of a mix of canopies. And so that's a pretty big challenge in Central California in understanding the population levels of and the canopy cover of bull kelp versus giant kelp in that region. And there are a lot of really exciting efforts, scientific efforts underway trying to tease some of that apart, but it's proved really challenging. So I can talk about just like kelp cover in general in Central California, but teasing apart which species is which is really challenging at this point. Yeah, good question though. We'd love to know.
Yeah, we had a couple people
really
ask that.
Those details are challenging to tease apart with the data, that at least with the data that I showed you. There's other data sets that you can kind of get more fine-tuned, but we don't have that same statewide data set that we do for some of the other species. Yeah.
Right, thank you.
Yeah.
What is the lifespan of an abalone?
Ooh, that is a good question. I should know that. I used to know that. They live for a pretty long time. They're pretty long-lived species. They're really slow growing, which is part of a really big challenge with managing them as a fishery species, because they just need so much time to grow big and strong and to get to that reproductive stage. There's some pretty exciting work going on. Well, it's happening up and down the coast, but is really spearheaded out of Bodega Marine Lab, really focusing on white abalone. I don't know if people are familiar with that species or some of those recovery efforts, but they're growing a lot of baby abalone in the lab. So they're learning a lot more about those early life history stages and that life cycle. That there's been research going on for decades about abalone and their life cycle, but I'm sorry, I don't have that exact number of how long the oldest abalone is. But generally they can live for a very long time, and they tend to be slow growing species.
We'll just have to get an abalone virtual mind walk presentation.
Definitely. Yeah.
So thank you for the suggestion, everybody. Another question, what happens to the urchins that get pulled as part of the recreational diver removal program?
The recreational or the commercial? Which piece?
This one says recreational.
The recreational. Yeah, that's a good question. So the recreational efforts in at Tanker Reef and at Casper Cove, those urchins are being, I put in quotes, removed. They're being culled using hammers. And so they are using hammers to reduce those densities in the water. So they're not actually largely getting taken out of the system physically. Whereas up in Northern California, that effort with commercial divers, the commercial divers are actually landing those urchins. So they're lifting them all the way out of the water and driving them over to the dock. And then they get donated for compost. Yeah.
Got it. Thank you. And I think that kind of addresses another question that came through that said, how can urchins be used?
Oh, outside of like once you land them, what do you do with a big pile
yeah,
of urchins? Yeah. It's a great question. And there's a lot of efforts underway to explore that, to explore what do we do with all of these urchins if they are getting removed from the system, to make them just more complete that full cycle and not just have a pile of urchins piling up on the dock. And so there are several groups that are exploring those efforts, and one of the groups is the Nature Conservancy. I know they're really digging into and expanding out some of those market-based solutions and trying to figure out what we do with all of those urchins. So I think I don't have a good answer in terms of we are still figuring that out, and there's a lot of exciting work that I think will be coming out pretty soon to hammer that stuff out. Yeah, good question.
Thank you. That is exciting. Another question, are artificial reefs such as the Wheeler North Artificial Reef and Palos Verdes Artificial Reef an effective way to maintain and recover kelp forests in California?
That's a really good question. So those two reefs, at least looking at the data and how quickly they've seen some kelp recruit there, that's pretty exciting. Those reefs were, one thing that's pretty important to think about is that thinking about why a forest isn't there anymore if it used to be. And so for thinking about artificial reefs, if your challenge that you're trying to overcome in terms of restoration is that you're losing substrate or that habitat, that structure, like hard rocky reef, which I talked about earlier in the talk, how important it is. Kelp doesn't grow very well on sand, right? They need that hard structure to grow. And so if you really are limited in your hard structure and your rocky reef, then that's where maybe some of those artificial reefs could come into play. But I think it's really important to think about what the stressors and what the challenges are you're trying to overcome and what those forests may be faced with. And so, yeah, lots of really good questions and things to be thinking about as we start moving forward into the future for kelp restoration and management. Yeah, good question.
Thank you for answering it. Are there certain seasons for kelp? For example, certain times of year they die off and new ones grow?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I had mentioned storms, but so generally, especially if you are living on the coast, you tend to know that we are kind of coming potentially out of the stormy season. Winter time tends to be pretty crazy out there. You can get some really great dive conditions in January, February, of course, but in a similar way, there's wave action can be really stressful and can rip kelp out. And so generally just through those physical processes, you tend to have less kelp in the winter time, and then going into spring, you see like really early recruits, so like new individuals popping up. And so their peak growth season is really in that summertime into the fall. But it does depend on where you are along the coastline and the species. And so like I had mentioned, also answering one of the other questions, bull kelp is an annual species. And so generally it tends to come in the springtime and grow over the summer and into fall. And then it undergoes this process, either it gets ripped out or this process called senescence, which giant kelp also can undergo, where you sort of get old and saggy, like kind of, I've seen it, the blades sometimes look like spider webby, like they're disintegrating, depending on the ocean conditions too. So tends to be a season like fall, late summer, fall tends to be a pretty good prime time for your kelp canopy cover, but it's a little variable. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Does the material which buries kelp come from land or the sea bottom?
Oh, that's a really good question. It can come from either. So depending on kind of the structure of your reef, you can have continuous rocky reefs where it's all connected along with for like a chunk along the coastline. Or you can have sort of more isolated reefs where you have sand channels like wiggling in and out of and separating out different forest structures. And so you can have movement of sand that way. It could come on and offshore. So that's where you would get sort of that burial and scouring effect along the edges of those rocky reefs coming from the ocean side. But when I was talking really about kind of like that widespread loss of kelp and making really patchy forests, that was actually, we saw an example of this when I was working in partnership with the Bay Foundation for my PhD, working on a reef down there that had been restored into a kelp forest. There was a landslide that occurred and buried a big chunk of that reef. And so we didn't see kelp grow in at that location. And so that little cartoon was more in reference to that sort of phenomenon, but you can have burial and sediment transport from pretty much any direction, depending on where your sand supply is. Yeah.
Thank you. A few more questions here. Are there any studies that have looked at the introduction of urchin predators as a tool for kelp restoration?
That's a good question. I think there's maybe some stuff that goes on up in British Columbia. I think they've looked at some of that. I could be wrong though. I'm not sure actually. That's a really good question. I think that hasn't really been done pretty substantially in the kelp forest system. There are other kelp marine ecosystems where they've explored that as a tool, but I don't know any studies off the top of my head that have tried that other than kind of from like a modeling perspective using models on the computer, for example. But I could be
sure
wrong.
that'd be a very complicated process, but it is interesting.
Yeah.
One question is, are sea stars coming back? And I'll let Kristen answer that if she wishes, but we actually do have a virtual mind walk all about sea star wasting syndrome coming up on March 18th, and that registration link is open on our website. But if you wanted to give a little sneak hint type thing, Kristen.
I will definitely let you guys wait and hear it from the experts next week. But so the sea stars, the die-off was pretty widespread, and it hit different species of sea stars differently. And so one of the ones that I was really referring to here that's a really important player in the kelp forest systems in California is the sunflower star. And so there are some efforts and research going on to understand the life history of that species and thinking about ideas for growing them in the lab and such, and understanding how many urchins they actually eat, or do they just scare urchins? And so lots of exciting research about sea stars, but we haven't really seen that species come back here in California. And so I will definitely let the experts next week dig into the nuances of all of that, but just wanted to give you a teaser, I guess, if you will.
Thank you. Yes, and thanks for the great sneak peek question, Joni, for asking that. This question is from a state park interpreter, Francesca. She's one of our local interpreters here. She wants to know if these graphics are available for their interpretive team to use in their marine education program.
Like some of the figures and graphs that I've shown, or the background imagery that you're seeing like here?
I'll let Francesca type that if she wants to be more specific, but if it's easier, I can connect you two and you can work that out.
Sure, I can give you a quick answer, at least for the figures, the data and the schematics that you saw that I showed earlier with the different community stressors, those are all publications. So as long as you cite them properly, you should be able to use those. The little background things were, I drew those as like cartoons and layered them on. So, but we can talk more if you were interested in using those. Yeah.
Perfect. I'll make sure to connect you too. And she said, yes, the figures and schematics. Thank you. Let's see, a couple more questions. Does storm damage and or kelp harvesting kill the entire stock, or do they regenerate from the original holdfast?
That's a really good question. So storms, it really depends on exactly how the storm or the harvest is done, how the storm is done, how the storm impacts the actual kelp. So typically, if you are ripping storms can rip that whole plant, or I'm calling it a plant, but the whole kelp off of the sea floor at that holdfast breaking point. And if it does, one thing that's really interesting about particularly giant kelp, but bull kelp too, they tend to get tangled in each other. And so you'll have a plant that pops off, maybe gets ripped off from a storm event, and then it gets entangled in other adjacent plants or individuals. And then that increases the drag. You have like more of a kelp blob getting swung around on the surface. And then it just causes more stress on the plant, I keep calling them plants, on the kelp that's attached to the sea floor. And then they tend to kind of rip out in these big chunks. And so the kelp, because unlike a plant, like a plant we have like in your garden or a tree that really needs that root structure to be in the soil for nutrient uptake on kelp happens along the blades and throughout the water column. And so they're not relying on that root structure. So they could theoretically be persisting in these little like rafting patches, which does happen. And that's like a mechanism for transport. And so you can get sort of like genetic connectivity through that mechanism. So they can kind of float and you can have these like patches of kelp, but they tend to wash up on shore. And particularly, you guys have probably seen them, huge mounds of kelp on your beaches get washed up. And so that will take the whole plant. And when they're out of the water, then they definitely don't make it. But they get consumed by a lot of other organisms that are really found predominantly in that beach raft system. And then the question disappeared. I think it got marked as answered, but I didn't finish the second. What was the second part of that question?
Oh, sorry. Let me find it again. Or do they regenerate from the original holdfast or kelp? Excuse me.
Yeah. Okay, sorry. So for harvest in California, you can only you're only able to take from that top piece of the kelp, so that it does have that ability to kind of regenerate and grow back. And then with bull kelp, there's a tendency for that harvest to happen partway on the blade, so you're not taking that whole individual. And so at least generally that's how it's been done, where they're harvested in a way where that regeneration could happen. But I think we still have a lot to learn about those elements of kelp growth and recovery, particularly for bull kelp. Yeah, good question.
Thank you. And it looks like we just have one more question left, unless anyone wants to add more. And I know this is probably a long answer, so I'm going to add a comment as well. Okay. June wants to know, what about the sea otter's role in the ecosystem, which is huge. June, we do have a handful of sea otter presentations available in our recording list if you check out our website to view our past programs. But Kristen, if you wanted to add any comments about their role.
Yeah, I'm not sure actually if you guys have had Josh Smith come to speak to you. He would be a great person to come talk. He just published some recent work on the role of sea otters in maintaining and protecting kelp forests. So his work really showed the role of otters really helping maintain those sort of, he called them, like, they're referred to as kind of urchin barren fronts, where you have that boundary between an urchin barren and a kelp forest. And so the otters being present in the kelp forest really help facilitate and maintain that persistence of the kelp, and that they really tend to only like to eat urchins that have uni or gonads inside them. I didn't really talk too much about that, but generally urchins that are found in the barren state where you have this like just a swath, like a paint, like it's painted with urchins, they tend to be very hungry and they'll eat anything and everything in their life, and tend not to have a lot of gonad material in them. And that's the piece that's delicious for urchins. So I don't know if you guys have seen pictures of otters eating urchin, but they crack them open and they eat the inside. You don't really want to eat the like pokey bits. And so if there's nothing inside them, it's, at least if I'm remembering correctly from his research, the otters tend to prefer consuming stuff that's inside them. I can really tell when there's good food inside them or not. And so they're good at maintaining those existing forests. Yeah, they do play a really critical role in that system. Good question.
Yes, thank you. I believe that is the last of our questions there. So I just wanted to make a couple of closing comments. First of all, thank you so much, Kristen, for joining us. This was fascinating, and I know people have been waiting for a kelp forest presentation. So I'm very glad that we finally got to share one. A couple comments for our audience members. Thank you for being here and for joining the virtual Mind Walk series. When you close out of this window, you should see a little survey pop up on your screen. It's super short and it's really helpful to us to kind of gauge what topics you want to hear about for future presentations, and if you have suggestions for anything else on ways we can improve. So that will be very helpful to us. And if you have any questions about today's program, you can email me. My email is the one that popped up when you received an email today as a reminder for this program. You can email me there, and I can connect with Kristen if your questions pertain to her presentation. So thank you so much, everybody. I hope you have a wonderful weekend. Thank you again, Kristen, and we will see you in a couple weeks for the Sea Star presentation. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, Kristen. Thank you so much.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Bye.